So this week we've got Gurman on the show, sales team leader from deposit alternative supplier Reposit. I've been following the deposit alternative journey for a long time, so I'm really pleased I've got someone on the show that we can have a discussion about that. Got some interesting stats coming up, which we'll be sharing. So before we discuss any of that, I want to take people back sort of 5 years ago and see what your feeling is in terms of the growth over the last 5 years in the deposit alternative world.
Yeah, sure. First of all, Lee, great to be here. Thanks for having me on. And 5 years in October, I've been at Reposit. It's definitely been a pretty interesting journey. I think when I started, honestly, the most surprising thing was the number of agents who simply didn't know a deposit alternative existed. My first job out of college was actually working for an independent estate and letting agent. And looking back, I could see a need for that product. And this was, unfortunately, it was 10 plus years ago. And I think, the concept of Reposit with tenants paying a fee of 1 week's rent and landlords receiving 8 weeks worth of protection and our product obviously being insurance backed. Honestly, it was just really alien to many agents as, taking a cash deposit has been the norm for such a long time. So I fully expected the deposit alternative market to grow, and it has, because I think it provides real benefits for all parties involved in the renting process. We look back at our growth since 2019, and it's really interesting. Like, we managed to grow our business by over 600%, when lettings volumes have remained relatively flat during the same period, and it's due to demand. It's due to demand from agents, landlords, and tenants. It's not just one single party. And what's also interesting is, over the last couple of years, we've seen several large, long-standing independent agents, such as Boydens, based in Colchester, Simmons and Sampson, who, both of who are partners. They've taken advantage of Reposit, and they've been operating for a long time, well over 100 plus years. So it's great to see agents like that, and you've obviously got developments in the build to rent sector, which is also interesting, and we're seeing huge growth there as well. We're currently partnered with over 15 operators right now. We just recently started working with 5 new sites across the UK. We've got more exciting announcements to the PRS and build to rent sectors to come. But I think it's all down to demand. I think the more people that know about deposit alternatives is great, and I think ultimately it's about choice. It gives an option to do something slightly different. And I think consumers should have options available to them, especially when it comes to to renting.
So is there, I know you've touched on some stuff there, but is there anything sort of new that's happening in the deposit alternative world?
Yeah, there's a lot of things happening constantly, obviously. But I think more recently what we have seen is obviously how deposit alternatives are growing in popularity. So we recently did some research, and we looked at some of our own stats, and we found that there had been over a 25% year-on-year increase in sales among 1 and 2 person tenancies with above average rents. So we're seeing the product become more popular across a growing portion of the market. And I think there's a few factors as to why that's happening. So you've obviously got the ongoing cost of living crisis, which is of course a driving factor. You've got interest rates rising, and I think what that does is obviously increase the cost of locking up a large sum in cash deposits if you're a tenant. Therefore, it's more attractive to actually keep hold of the money to save, invest, or spend on what you want during the course of your tenancy. One of the big things I always talk about is furniture, because most tenants move into a new home and often need to buy some furniture, and they can use the money for that. I was actually looking at some stats, and this was, to be fair, this was at the end of March. And if we looked at the average 5-week deposit back then, and you looked at the average tenancy length in the UK, as well as the Bank of England base rate, you would actually lose out on over £150 in interest. So there are just, financially savvy tenants out there who realize this actually, and would rather use the money for something else. There's also tenants who also appreciate things like inflation and would rather use the Reposit option or a deposit alternative option as opposed to paying that cash deposit. So this has been huge, and it's great. We're seeing more and more tenants obviously, look at deposit alternatives. I think when you look at the rental market, obviously from an agent's point of view, there's a lot of pressure right now. We're seeing, the market is very competitive. Obviously, there's a lack of stock, which is, a big talking point right now. And we're actually seeing more agents wanting to use a deposit alternative because margins are tight, and they want to obviously make sure they're offering the best available cover to their landlords. And we're in a good position because we can support agents both commercially from a sort of commission point of view, which I'll talk about later as well, because it's quite key to some stats, and operationally as well, because we can save them a lot of time at the end of the tenancy in comparison to a cash deposit. We spoke to an agent 2 weeks ago, actually, based in the Southwest, and really interesting. They've been going out to valuations for the past month, 6 weeks, and they've lost around sort of 70% of their valuations. And one of the key reasons being is because 3 agents in the area all offering a deposit alternative, and they have had direct feedback from landlords who have said, "Oh, we chose X agent because they offer an alternative to cash deposits, and that gives you more protection." So we're seeing landlords who are actually requesting deposit alternatives too, which is a really interesting time, because I remember when I joined Reposit in 2019, there weren't many agents who even knew what they were, never mind landlords. So I think that's a really interesting trend. You've obviously had updates with the government too. The How to Rent guide was updated twice last year, and it's the first time now actually they mentioned deposit alternatives, which is great, because I think tenants need to be aware of options, and the fact that we're regulated by the FCA. The guidelines, very much encourage tenants to check that the product is regulated. It aligns us really nicely for those who are looking for a fully compliant solution. And aside from that, I suppose we release numerous features every single year. We have a product called Switch, which actually allows tenants to switch from a cash deposit to Reposit, which is really interesting in the current climate, because obviously most tenants have X amount of cash sitting with one of the government deposit schemes, so they have the option to switch over. But we're ultimately seeing the features that we release have a really positive impact across the partners that use Reposit. We're seeing more and more partners now have majority of their lets going through with Reposit on a monthly basis, and once again down to that demand. So yeah, there's a lot going on. I think ultimately what's new is that more and more agents and tenants and landlords as well are becoming aware that there is actually another option. It's not just about taking a 5-week deposit or a month. There's actually another option you could look at if you wanted to.
I'm with you. And in terms of the stats you spoke on, I wanted to kind of see if you had any other that you could bring onto the show and touch on them now for me, and then we can move on to maybe some predictions as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we've been looking at a lot of data and stats over the last, I suppose, couple of years really, because the fact is that most agents enjoy the stats, and it's obviously very interesting for us to see what's happening in within our own performance too. One of the interesting bits of research that we did carry out was around deposits and arrears, and a lot of data here, but it is super interesting. So what we did is we looked at data from Jan 2021 to the end of Q1 2024. And we found that the average rent arrears has climbed to just over £1,800. Last year it was kind of 1,400, so 27% increase year on year. Obviously a big jump, very much a sign of the amount of pressure that's on the rental sector right now, on both landlords and tenants, right? Because a lot of the rent arrears is due to things like, mortgage rates increasing and landlords kind of having to increase rents, and not tenants obviously struggling for affordability. Now, what's really interesting about the data is that while the amount for arrears grew, the actual claim value, the rate has slowed down a little bit. So the rate grew by only 0.8% between Q4 last year and Q1 this year. But between Q1 2023 and Q2 2023, it grew 11%. Following months of obviously rising inflation, which kind of peaked as well. But ultimately, I think this is very much down to the fact that the Bank of England base rate climbed, I think 1.5% between, I think it's Q1 2023 and at the end of Q2 2023 was 3.5, then to 5%. And ultimately, this is just pushing landlords' mortgage repayments higher during that time. And obviously, there are a lot of landlords in the market speaking to agents every single day. There are landlords in the market who were, letting their properties out for below market, and they're having to catch up. And the fact they're having to catch up is also then pricing some tenants out. And unfortunately, there are some, situations where rent arrears do arise. But during the first 3 months of 2024, we're seeing the percentage of tenants ending their tenancy with unpaid rent increase to 18%. That's slightly up from last year as well. Last year was about 15.3%. And it's just really reflective of the trends we're seeing across the sector. In April this year, there was a report from the lenders trade body, UK Mortgage. Basically, they revealed that at the end of Q4 2023, there was over 13,500 buy-to-let mortgages in arrears. which is obviously insane.
Hmm.
There were also 500 buy-to-let mortgage repossessions in Q4 2023, which was up
Hmm.
56%, year on
Wow.
year, which is it's just nuts when you think about it.
It is.
And it's ultimately down to the difficult backdrop we're seeing in the economy for mortgage rates and rents obviously increasing a lot year
Hmm.
on year. We've seen our own data that the monthly rent has increased by over 10% across Q1 2024. Um, so, and I think Zoopla released a report last week that I read actually where the rents have increased even further. So I think right now the average rent in the UK is £1,226 per calendar month, which is 6.6% up year on year.
Hmm.
Um, it's cooled down a little bit, but it's still really high. So
Yes.
those are the main stats that we've been looking at, and I think ultimately, as I say, we're seeing all these a lot of this is coming from the pressures in the market, right?
Hmm.
And when you look at 5-week cash deposits and what the average is coming out to, which is I suppose now around kind of 1,300-1,400 pounds, landlords I think are realizing that actually they're at risk of not having enough deposit to cover any
Yes.
possible losses. Um, we've seen in our own data as well that in 14% of cases, a 5-week cash deposit is actually not enough protection for a landlord. And obviously with Reposit, they get 8 weeks. So they have that advantage of having more protection at the end of the tenancy.
Hmm.
One of the biggest things actually, although I don't have a stat for this, but it's quite interesting, is over the last 18 to 24 months, there has been obviously rent increases throughout the market. And there are a lot of agents, landlords trying to catch up to that figure because obviously you've got mortgage rates impacting the amount of rent that landlords need to collect and so on. One of the biggest things that kind of shocks me, and I'm not surprised, but speaking to agents, and I've only come across 2 agents who do this, but 99% of agents don't top up the deposit when the rents
Okay.
increase. And that actually long term causes quite a lot of problems because a lot of landlords have increased the rent by 20-30% because they've had to catch up. They've been below market for a long time. And what's interesting is if the tenant falls into arrears, your deposit is just simply just not enough because it's not in line with what the rental value is. And it is interesting because there's a lot of work to like top of the deposits, but obviously with things like deposit alternatives in general, you get more protection.
Mm. Mm.
And it's great to see landlords acknowledge that because there is less paperwork and less admin for the agent or landlord to do anything just because they have more protection anyway. But that's been something I've seen. I don't have any stats on it, but just from speaking with agents every single day, it's
Yes.
definitely something I've come across quite a lot actually, especially in the last like say 18 to 24 months.
Brilliant. Thank you for those insights and those stats. I
Yeah,
do
I feel like I
appreciate
spoke a
you.
lot there, so I'm sorry.
No, 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 that's good. That's what we want. We want me quiet and you speaking. I don't have the stats. I don't see what's happening firsthand. So it's good that you've brought them. And the first part of my question was obviously I wanted the stats, but I also want some property predictions from you as well. So have you brought any of those for us?
Yeah, it was quite tricky actually because there's a lot going on in the market right now, and I think
Yep.
it's pretty tricky to make a good prediction actually. Obviously, I've talked a lot about kind of what's happening in the market. I do think rental inflation will slow down. I think we'll probably look at more 5% over the course of 2024. I mentioned earlier, obviously rents are currently up 6.6%, and I think it's going to kind of cool down. And the main reason being is because like it's just been so unsustainable for a long time, so it kind of had to. At the same time, obviously, competition for properties is pretty high.
Mm.
I read a Zoopla report last week, and I think it's still averaging at 15 households are looking at average rental property in the market, which is still
Yes.
nuts. That's actually down by 25%, which is scary. So it's kind of hard to predict what's going to happen when it comes to sort of the policy front as well. Obviously, the renters reform bill being kind of kicked down the road, I think it's going to come back. So I thought a little bit about what's happening across other industries and how that can impact like the property market too, because
Hmm.
I think it's very hard for me to make a prediction on what's going to happen with the government. So
Yes.
I actually want to bring AI into the conversation, which I thought would be
Okay.
super relevant. And I was actually looking at a company in the US that I'll mention later, but I do think AI is going to massively increase over the coming years. I'm already seeing some larger agents take advantage of AI, and having spoken to a few clients that we work with, they're looking at AI for things like property descriptions, which is like really basic, right? But
Hmm.
I think the way it's going to progress is I think AI will be used for enhanced property search, whether
Yes.
you're a tenant or a buyer. I think there's going to be better analytics for pricing, which is actually great because that's really going to help agents speed up like their valuation process, which obviously just means they reduce their admin time. But I think it's going to be more accurate to kind of what's happening in the current market.
Hmm.
I think there's going to be some fantastic AI for property management, which is a big part of lettings in particular.
Mhm.
So things like managing maintenance, energy, things like that. Issues within properties. I think there's going to be tools that get released for that. So there's a lot to come, and I think there's already some agents taking advantage of certain things. I know
Mhm.
many agents are using things like ChatGPT for
Yes.
or bots for things like property descriptions, which is great. Why not take advantage of it? It's going to help reduce admin time. But what's really interesting was I was looking at a company in the US actually, so a long way away across the pond. So a company called Rentberry, who've actually grown quite a bit. So I think they now operate in over 60 countries. But it's basically a completely online digital platform where they match rental properties and tenants online.
Mhm.
Now, it sounds really kind of simple. There's probably been some companies in the UK that tried this before, and there continues to be. But they actually use AI technology to analyze like local market data to recommend appropriate rental prices. But what they also use is the data to match recommend landlords and tenants, which is really interesting. So they look at profiles of tenants and what they do. They do a lot of co-living stuff as well, which is obviously, I think interesting, especially considering the amount of digital nomads there are across the world, across the world. But they're using AI quite a bit across their platform to help, a landlord and tenant sort of, I guess, be that perfect match.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's my sort of property predictions, just because I looked at the market and thought, you know what, I'm not even going to try and predict what's going to happen with on the policy front and the renters reform bill and so on, because I
No.
think there's a lot of uncertainty there.
Yes.
But I think where there is certainty is that AI is going to have a big impact in the property sector in the coming years.
And I think that's a safe, a good prediction.
Yeah, for sure.
I think avoiding the other ones was a good move for you. So I want to ask you, because obviously we've touched on landlord, we've touched on the tenant, um, and I want to ask you, kind of for the letting agent, what's in
Mm.
it for them?
Yeah, great question. I mean, really, Reposit is a great way to enhance their lettings offering and, really help accelerate their business. Now, when I think of it, when you think about a cash deposit, it's really core to the lettings process, therefore core to what a lettings business does. What
Hmm.
our product is designed to do is just seamlessly fit into their current process. So we're not drastically changing things. I remember the conversations back in 2019 when I talked about Reposit, and they were like, "No, with the TDS." I'm like,
Hmm.
"Yeah, fine, you can, offer a deposit." They're like, "No, no, no such thing as a deposit alternative exists." So that's definitely changed. So what we're really there to do is help agents reduce admin around the end of tenancy process, which is very time consuming. And often when you speak to agents, it's definitely the biggest pain point they have as a business,
Hmm.
that end of tenancy process. We're there to help them reduce risk because we're offering more cover to landlords, which obviously is beneficial at that end of tenancy. The fact that we're giving more cover makes them more competitive as well, which is a really big point. So when you're going out
Hmm.
to market appraisals, the fact that you can talk about you partner with Reposit and you can offer that additional protection is really important,
Hmm.
especially in the current climate where stock is, a problem, and I think the market is getting more and more competitive.
Hmm.
At the same time, we're giving, agents are able to give tenants a valuable choice, which I think is really important. And in addition, we help agents generate a new and fully compliant income stream. So on the back of each deposit they introduce, there is a kickback opportunity for the agent. And I know that's important to a lot of agents who are looking to drive additional income into their business. And that's
Hmm.
something we can support with. So ultimately, we're there to help, make them get them in a position where they can win more landlords, they can
Yes,
generate income, save admin, and I think, give tenants a valuable choice, which I think is actually, really important given the current climate.
I agree. And I always end the podcasts in the same way. I always like to ask some questions about, the guest as opposed to the company. So I want to ask you some questions about you, which is, what have you learned from being in this field that people should know?
The world is a small place. I've learned that building long-lasting relationships is really important.
Yep.
Um, the UK property sector may seem really big, but it is really small. So I think making sure you focus on building a long-lasting relationship is super important. I think it's important no matter what industry you're in, but I think
Hmm.
within this industry, extremely important.
Brilliant. And my next question is, what's your favorite thing about what you do?
Yeah, it's a good question. Honestly, I think it's helping agents grow their business. One of the key things we look to do from a sales perspective at Reposit, especially in the new business side, is really try and understand what the agent's goals are and
Hmm.
what challenges they have in their current business, right? And that's outside of just like deposit and alternatives. It's also just
Hmm.
like, what are you kind of, looking to achieve and what are your challenges? And at the same time, we look at motivations behind adopting a deposit alternative and very much a case of how can we support them to hit their goals and challenges. And honestly, I think that's the most. I think it's my favorite thing. I worked with some agents over the last 4 or 5 years now, and it's great to see how much their business has grown. At the same time, seeing Reposit, growing too. And yeah, it's really cool to look back, especially given there's some agents I spoke to where first spoke to them, they had 10 managed properties, and now they have 500, 600, 700 plus managed properties. So it's
Brilliant.
great to see like their growth and their journey too, which is something I can sort of share with them as well.
Yeah, no, I like that. I really do, and I think that's a great part of being able to see that journey. So, my final question for you is: who is the most influential person in your life, and how did they impact you?
That's a good question. Okay, I can't say one person, so I'm going to go with my parents. I think that's probably what most people say.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, I was thinking about a sports player, then I thought, I'll go with my parents because they'll be upset
Yeah,
if I don't say anything.
yeah, you got to go with them.
So, I think they instilled a really strong work ethic and mentality, and they've kind of always pushed me to, I suppose, want more out of life and go for opportunities that they didn't necessarily have growing up to. So yeah, definitely probably the most influential people in my life, outside of some famous footballer or cricketer or whatever. So yeah.
Look, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been absolutely amazing having you on. Appreciate all the insights, appreciate all the stats, appreciate you explaining it, appreciate you going through it from the tenant, the landlord, and the agent's perspective, and what's in it for them. So thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
That's great. Thanks so much for having me, Lee.